Hey, I just finished reading First Enoch, and I really want to talk about it. So, do you want to have that conversation?
Dude, why are you always coming with this weird stuff? It's not in the Bible for a reason. Just get out of here.
All right, welcome to Your Church Friends podcast. I'm Chris.
You're the
So, are we just going to jump into this episode or?
yes.
Yes.
You're the intro guy. if
It's
you
just
don't
like-
have one,
This is going to be a lot of chapters we're covering. So, it looks like
all of a sudden you're
Yeah.
realizing how much work is before us. You're not like, hey, yeah, Book of First Enoch. What do you think? Like
I
3
really
episodes?
thought we would do it in one. I mean, originally when we were talking about First Enoch and covering it, I was like, we could do that in one episode. We'll just cover everything.
Look, we could.
Mm-hmm.
It would just be a different thing.
Yeah. Because I seen people who did it. Like on YouTube, I watched a guy who did it in like 22 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
Clearly, he's better than me and you, that he could do that and stay so rigid on it. Because for me, I'm like, oh, but this.
You know
but
what it
this.
is?
Yeah.
It's him, and he can write out a script
Yeah,
and just
true.
do it.
Yeah.
You have to deal with me. I'm a wild card. He's like, cool, we can get through this. I'm like, did you hear about this? Well, there goes for the next 40 minutes.
Yeah, that is true.
Yeah.
That is. So we got what is it? 37 to 50 something?
54.
54?
That's where I went. So if
Yeah,
you want to do
so-
55, you're on your own.
Nope, we're doing 37 to
It's your time to
54
shine.
on First Enoch. That's the time I picked. Yeah, so we got a lot. 37 through 71 is the parables, is what it's called. So this is the parable section. There's 3 of them in there. The book of parables is, in terms of word count, nearly twice the length of the book of Watchers. So
Yeah.
a lot of words. The book of parables is composed, like I said, of 3 parables or visions received by Enoch that really only make up the chapters of 37 through 59. And then from 59 to 71 is just kind of more filler stuff. Oh, here it is. I had
Some
it in my notes.
filler stuff.
60 to 71 seems to be incorporated, an incorporation of another independent source that was put into the book of parables. So
That's how I got that. It seemed like it came in later.
yeah, someone was like, hey, this fits here. Might as well add it to that. Which I guess when you're looking at it in the whole, when people are like credibility of the Bible or books, and it's like, someone was like, hey, here's some other stuff. Let's just throw it in here. It fits. Does kind of seem to come with the discredit part.
I get that, but at the same time, I think we talked about it before, that in the scriptures, you have that kind of an editing
Mhm.
process.
Yes.
Where
we did.
later stuff, like as people are going through and scribes are copying it, like
Yeah.
they're putting in things. So maybe some super fundamentalist people just stop the podcast. But it's in there.
Yeah. So this is that whole section. I think it introduces some new material. Yeah, it does introduce some new material. The heavenly visions focusing on the final judgment. This section is particularly relevant to the New Testament scholarship as it describes the Son of Man and with final judgment in itself. And we'll get into that a little bit more. I just got a few more details, and then we could jump into what I think the Son of Man. We'll start with the Son of Man.
That's where I thought you were going,
yeah.
since that's what you just said.
Little more introduction, and then I'll get into the Son of Man part. Scholars of First Enoch, for the most part, agree that it is chronologically the last section of the overall book that was written. So, out of the 5 books that we're going to cover, I believe, is it 5?
Let's see. You got Watchers, got Parables. Is
The
that
Astronomy,
Yeah, Luminaries, Astronomy.
yeah, the Epistle,
Mm-hmm.
and then Noah.
Yeah, so I think that's
So
5.
there's about 5 of them.
Wow, we just did that off the top of our heads.
we
Maybe
did.
we're still not as good as that YouTube guy.
No, but we're getting there.
We have 5 things.
We could remember 5. So yeah, it's one of the last ones. Dating this parable is actually difficult for a few reasons. It is the only major section not discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls or the Qumran. If it had been discovered there, it could be dated confidently before 68 AD. James Vanderkam, which for the next few episodes I'll probably reference him a lot, dates it between the 1st century BC and the 1st century AD. Unlike the other sections that have fragments in Aramaic and Greek, this is only exist in, hopefully I'm saying this right, Gizi? With the little,
That's Ethiopian.
yeah,
Yeah.
the Ethiopian language. So it's only in there. The manuscripts, they have it in its very latest state is from the 15th century. So despite that, scholars believe that it is still was translated from Hebrew or Aramaic, but they just don't have anything on it.
You did pronounce that wrong, but it's not for the life of me. Can I remember? Uh, it's Ethiopian, basically.
Yeah.
Gez? I don't know. It's not Gizi.
It's easy when you're geezy.
All right. See, here's the thing where you edit the podcast,
Yeah.
so I can't cut that out.
Nope. I'm
All
gonna
right.
leave it in. No early Jewish or Christian writers apparently quote from it. So, or if they did, it was done so rarely and indirect. So, like I said, there's 3 sections. So there's First Enoch 1:56, 5 through 8. Many scholars identify the writing here with I think it's Parthians, who invaded the land in 40 BC. And then in 67-8, the wicked king who indulges in the hot spas may refer to King Herod the Great when he was before his death in 4 BC. So that's kind of, these events help with the idea of where they want to date it, but I think dating it has some difficulties.
Yeah. I think especially when you look at history and different things, and here I am speaking way outside of my expertise, if I even have one of those. This isn't it. But with different historical things that we discover, right? And things that we know about or don't know about, that I feel like can be a danger to like, well, we don't know when this is written, but we know about these things.
Mm-hmm.
So it lines up close enough. It probably has to do with that thing. It's like, think about how many things happen that are just lost to history.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So that's where he's saying it comes with problems. I think to be so confident in like, well, this is later and we think it's later because it wasn't this, and it seems it very well could be that. But that's where I guess that line between speculation, between like having a lot more hard proof.
Yeah.
You know, I think that the dating on this doesn't really come with that hard proof.
No, it doesn't. It's
Yeah,
a lot
that's the
of,
point that I'm trying to get to,
Yeah,
is
it's a
that-
lot of speculation.
Yeah.
It's looking at the material and trying to like decipher wording to like line it up with something. For some reason, and I guess this is that episode, or Enoch is the episodes we could do it more with. But I kind of thought when I was reading that and even studying it, Nostradamus.
Mm-hmm.
And like all of his writings, and then it's decades later, people are like, oh, but if you look at this perfectly fits for this prediction, and this is what he
Right.
was saying. But it
Right.
was like, was he really though? Because you just kind of made it seem like that. So yeah, I get what you're saying.
Yeah, so kind of just going along with that with the dating, where I personally, and again, this is just my very much personal things looking at it, not to be kicking up against people who are way more learned than me. But when I look at the dating of the rest of everything, it's a much older book than leading up to 4 BC,
Yeah.
seemingly. And again, that would be the thing of, oh, this is a later edition because it's a later edition.
Mm-hmm.
But something within me just sounds like, no, it's all older.
Yeah.
I don't know what difference that makes, but for some reason I'm just like, I want it all to be older.
Yeah.
It is interesting though, because if you get into like 4 BC or 4 AD, what were we saying, somewhere around there? That's right around Jesus's birth, which when we get into this topic that we're about to get into is the Son of Man. It's interesting because if it was that later date, it's possible that Jesus could have been born and someone started writing about the Son of Man.
Yeah.
Which is an interesting thing to even think about it that way. Which there's a good segue right there.
That was a
Son
good
of
segue.
Man. Let's
Son
do
of
it.
Man, let's do it. So really we get into this more, chapter 38. When we finish this, we'll backtrack into 37 a little bit, but 38 begins the first parable that ends in 44, and this section introduces some main characters that the rest of the book of parable kind of follows in: the righteous, which are humans, the wicked, humans, the Lord of spirits, God. Go backwards and talk about that a little bit more. The righteous one, the Messiah, and the righteous one is this phrase isn't taken as pointing to God himself, but another figure. The title will vary throughout the parable from righteous one 16 times, anointed one, chosen one, to Son of Man. So the Son of Man is a key figure in this parable. George Nicholsberg describes the Son of Man as a transcendent heavenly figure who represents the most remarkable of all Jewish synthesis of speculation about the agents of divine activity. This Son of Man combines 4 tracts of the Old Testament thought concerning the agents of God's activity on earth. So we have the Son of Man from Daniel,
Mm-hmm.
the Chosen One or the Suffering Servant from Isaiah. This is the defender of the righteous against their enemies and the wicked. And a lot of this will sound familiar as it's derived from the servant song of Isaiah 40 through 55. First Enoch 49, 3 through 4 is almost a direct quote of Isaiah 42:1. It says, "Here is my servant whom I uphold, my chosen one, in whom I delight. I will put my spirit on him, and he will bring justice to the nations." So it's almost like it's a direct quote from Isaiah. And then number 3, the Messiah of the Davidic tradition. And then number 4, the personification of wisdom from Proverbs, and then Ben Sirach. So that's just in there. In the Old Testament, just a few comparisons to the Old Testament. Isaiah 6, the prophet sees the Lord enthroned and served by the seraphim. One of the seraphim burns Isaiah's lips with hot coal to purify them so that he can proclaim God's message of repentance to the people. Ezekiel 1 contains imagery similar to Daniel 7 and Revelation 4 with creatures that look like earthly animals. Ezekiel 1, 26 through 28 contains an image of God enthroned. In Ezekiel 2, 3, God sends Ezekiel to proclaim his word to rebellious people. So again, these are just all images of, I guess, Son of Man that are in the Old Testament.
It's so hard when you're reading something like that, or you're giving all kinds of those, because I'm listening to them all. I'm like, yeah, that's there, and just thinking of that. But then in the back of my mind, when you said Ben Sirach, I still can't. When we're talking about Ben Sriracha, some stupid stuff just doesn't leave my mind.
Yeah. You know what's funny is when I said it, I thought it too.
Yeah. I think it's kind of more Ben Sirach.
Yeah,
kind of like the
but it's just
CH
always
on
comes
the end
out
of my name.
Sriracha. Yeah.
Mirdach. You're talking like Siri over there.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that was a pretty like almost exhaustive look of like some of the Son of Man stuff, which is good. Because it's important when we're in the New Testament. If you haven't read or studied the Old Testament, Jesus referencing himself as the Son of Man seems to come out of nowhere.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So I feel like even for maybe a lot of Christians who haven't spent time in the Old Testament, everything that you were just talking about, the Son of Man, is just going to give good insight to like, oh, so Jesus making that reference has all of those touch points.
Right.
But then when we get into Enoch, it's pulling in like, oh, that was also a touch point within the culture, kind of Second Temple period, like looking at the Son of Man. And a lot of the material in the Second Temple was looking, into the scriptures and trying to make sense of it and, in new ways. And so when they're looking at the Son of Man, Enoch's take on it it's pretty interesting. And because these are in these parables, these visions, right? These heavenly visions, I think that most of what we get is kind of like Revelation type language, right?
Yeah.
But I think that there is some controversy as far as Enoch and the Son of Man.
There is. Yeah. I do want to touch real quick that it's the Gospel of John. It appears 13 times that Jesus refers to himself as the Son of Man, especially with the theme of the crucifixion and, like you said, revelation and eschatological authority. So it does seem that John is using the same Son of Man figure from Daniel 7. So John isn't using the title to emphasize Jesus' humanity, but more like his heavenly origin and divine authority.
Yeah, absolutely. I think just because we're talking about this type of imagery, but just to pull from First Enoch itself, I think this is the first time that we get the reference of Son of Man versus Righteous One or anything like that. Is it in chapter 46? And this will sound familiar to Revelation readers, right? So 46 in the beginning says, "And there I saw one who had a head of days, and his head was white like wool, and with him," right? So there we have like the Ancient of Days, like would be said, and this is where you drew in the distinction earlier that this Righteous One is different than God on the throne. So you have this Ancient One, the head of days, his head was white like wool, and with him was another being whose countenance had the appearance of a man, and his face was full of graciousness like one of the holy angels. And I asked the angel who went with me and showed me all the hidden things concerning that Son of Man, who he was and whence he was, and why he went with the head of days. And then it goes on from there, right? So just getting some of that imagery there of what we do get in the Bible. So it's interesting that this written, even if it was written as late as 4 BC, you have John writing Revelation, and like that's almost, was that Revelation 4 or 5?
Yeah,
No,
4.
2. Well, in 1 you get the one sitting on the throne, right? So yeah, some of that stuff there.
Yeah.
So again, the ways of imaging and thinking about these things were definitely there.
Yeah, John Collins, a scholar, said that the early Christians very well could have readily associated the risen Christ with the Enoch, son of man. Andrade Orville, I hope I'm pronouncing his name right. He adds also the description of the chosen one in the parables paints a picture of a highly elevated celestial being. This being apparently has his own throne in the celestial realm, since of the passages found in First Enoch 45:3-4 depict the chosen one as the one who has been installed on the throne of glory. And I really did like that last bit too, where it was like John isn't when he calls himself the Son of Man. It's not emphasizing Jesus's humanity, but his heavenly origin and divine figure. That this is putting these kind of visions together.
Mhm.
That it's more than just like a Son of Man, which does kind of go back to what you were saying earlier. That kind of controversy, because in some of First Enoch, Enoch also refers to himself as a son of man. And that's where a lot of people will pull this and be like, it's straight blasphemy. Don't even read it, because Enoch is then calling himself the divine one, the righteous one, and everything like that. Which is kind of weird, because in Ezekiel, the term son of man simply is a reference for himself as well. So he does the same thing.
Mhm.
I think there's drawn differences with like Daniel, son of man, and Ezekiel, son of man. And even when they do point the picture of like a bigger son of man in the Bible, like if I remember right, the S is capitalized,
Yeah.
and
But
the
I
other
think we
ones,
do that.
yeah, we do that, but it's to show that there's a difference in the terminology. So I think a lot of the controversy for the son of man term, especially in First Enoch, gets kind of pulled as like, well, Enoch used it for himself, so obviously this isn't something we should use.
Yeah, and we'll get into that not in this episode but next episode, because I think it's at the end of these parables at chapter 71.
Yeah, in the end of there.
And so it gets into there and looking at Enoch kind of being that righteous one, and then the language that gets used there as far as son of man and how that is kind of putting him into that place. It's hard when I look at some of that too, because I think about John the Baptist and Elijah. Right? Elijah's kind of come back, and Jesus like, well, if you can believe it, this guy is Elijah, right? If you
Yeah.
have eyes to see that, like, this is what this is. So I almost wonder if some of the things that getting here where people are understanding or thinking like, oh no, this is Enoch, but just where you have this thought setting up like Elijah, he was a man of God who, kind of how you're saying the Son of Man is that title and is bringing in those ideas. So people know who Elijah is. But when you have John, it's not like reincarnation.
Right.
Right? It's not like, oh no, this is Elijah's spirit from the grave coming into this man, and here's Elijah walking. It's like, no, that's when you're saying that it's going to be him, here's how you should understand that. And when you do have Enoch being a righteous guy, he didn't die. Like, as far as any human, like, he's the only one that we have is just like, no, he walked with God every day. So when you're seeing this guy who's a type of righteous man, to look at that kind of archetype type idea, just like, no, he is a righteous one, then the righteous one who's coming, the Son of Man who's coming, you'd think would be the most similar to him. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I'm not trying to lessen Jesus. I'm just trying to link thoughts a little bit there.
Yeah. I see what you're saying there. Yeah. Especially because I think one of the misunderstandings that comes from like the New Testament, or in part, is just like, and you touched on this earlier, is that we believe when they start referencing Jesus as the Son of Man in the New Testament, it's like they're starting from scratch with a new concept or a new idea. Like, here are new facts, there are a new religion has just started, when they're actually going backwards and pulling from the Old Testament and really then placing that in the New Testament. So it's not that the New Testament writings are presenting something new. This is something that was already in its, I guess I won't say core values, but just in the backbone of the belief that the theme of the New Testament is this messianic divine Son of Man will judge faithfully.
And I think there, to pull in kind of that identity and looking at it, you can read through the New Testament not understanding the background of the Son of Man, and you can then read through the New Testament without that background of the Son of Man, and you can still see Jesus, and you can see who he is and the teachings, and when you get to those parts, you'll just fill in the blank.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's not the most essential to becoming a Christian, to following Jesus, right? To any of those things. But I think that when you do dig into it and you get this understanding, and when you're linking into the Messiah and all of these things, it becomes richer and it fills in those parts of the story to where there's like more to what God has been doing through human history. These are prophecies that are coming through, and like, what are these prophecies based off of? And what does that mean? And especially as we get into these parables, not saying that these parables and these visions are what, as Christians, we base things off of. But as you said, there's a lot about the righteous and the unrighteous when we get into these parables. That's a huge thing about the judgment.
Yeah.
And getting that in there. And when we're looking at like understanding more of like who the Messiah is, what judgment is, to be counted as one of the righteous ones because of who the Son of Man is and what that looks like here on earth and beyond, is like, those kinds of things do shape your life.
Yeah.
Like, it's not essential to come to a basic understanding, but as you learn more of those things, it's just like, oh, I'm part of a bigger thing and I know more of my role. Like, the awareness does something.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I've got one more thing, and then you could do the overview.
It's a quick overview, and then
and then we could chop into a little bit of the stuff. But Father Stephen D. Young said, the passages of the Son of Man and the parables have widely held to have influenced the New Testament writing. And other New Testament titles, such as the Righteous One and the Elect One, have been said to have appeared first as messianic designation. But this view has been increasingly questioned, especially since the discovery of the Qumran fragments. For although all the other sections of First Enoch are well represented in these fragments, chapters 37 to 71 are not represented at all, nor are they represented in the Greek or Latin fragments. It is probable, therefore, that they are later Christian insertions into the book, and that it was the New Testament which influenced them rather than vice versa. So even as we're talking about all of this, Stephen D. Young, someone who's put a lot of time into First Enoch, way more than we, is saying there's a good chance that this section was influenced by New Testament writing, so it's picking up on the same thing and kind of going that way.
I shake my head at you, sir.
Why?
You let me sound like a fool earlier saying this needs to be older. Stephen D. Young, of course he's right.
Of course he's right, but he could be wrong.
I redact my prior statements.
I forgot I had that quote. That's why.
Yeah,
sorry.
Thanks for that. Stephen D. Young, we think we reference him quite a bit.
Yeah.
He's one of the hosts over there on The Lord of Spirits. Which actually the intro for their podcast
is First Enoch.
It's found in one of these parables.
Yeah.
Here. So that's cool. We'll maybe highlight that when we get there. So yeah, when we're looking at this section, as you said, it's 3 parables. It's really helpful in this section because the parables are chopped up and they basically tell you, like, here's the first parable, here's the second parable, here's the third parable, which is nice because when you get in all this vision stuff and it does span, each parable spans several chapters, you can kind of get lost in like, wait, whoa, you're kind of talking about somewhat different stuff. So it's good to be able to bookend those, which I think the second and third also has closings out. And that was the second parable.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like, hey, we're starting the second, and it tells you that was the second, and it goes, here's the third, and that was the third. So it's nice structurally to be able to have that. When we're looking at the 2 parables that we're going to be looking at today, though, they follow a similar format. In the terms of, it's typically, it comes in the form of a vision, and then you have the seer, who is Enoch, asking a question, and then there being an angelic interpretation of the vision, which is familiar to us through Old Testament prophets and seers having that, right? To where they get shown something, so they see it, and then they go, what was that? And then an angel goes, let me tell you what you just saw, right? So it follows that format in these. But to just highlight the 2 that we're getting into with Parable 1 and Parable 2, they have this thing of each one starts with a vision of the throne room. And then after that, there's a journey. So Parable 1, you have the vision of the throne room, followed by a journey through the cosmos. And then Parable 2, you have a vision of the throne room, followed by journeys to the place of punishment. And what's also cool is if you take what we're going to be looking at here, it does parallel some of what we got in the Book of the Watchers.
Yeah.
So when you're looking at that vision of the throne room in Parable 1, which is basically chapters 39 and the beginning of 40, that's chapters 14 through 16 that we already went over. And then as we kind of very briefly went over some of those journeys through the cosmos when we were going through the Book of the Watchers, for Parable 1, that's chapters 41 through 44. And then from what we covered earlier, that would be chapter 17 through 18.5, verse 5.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say point. And the second parable is the same thing. Yeah, that vision of the throne room, which for us is going to be chapters 46 through 49. And that covers that same part as far as the vision. And then journey to the place of punishment. That's basically chapters 52 through 56. And that would be paralleling chapters 18 and then also 21 from what we covered earlier. So I said a bunch of numbers right now. If you're listening, is great. You have a pause button. So if you're following along and you read and then just go to those numbers and go back and reread the first thing and see the parallels that are getting drawn there. And I think that, as you said earlier, that one of the things that it's really covering is the judgment. And looking at the judgment, it's really looking at the group between the two people. You have the righteous ones and the unrighteous and what happens there. I think also looking at judgment, there's a couple spots actually to where we get to this view of the eschatological judgment, like the end times judgment, the final judgment. But then it brings it back to Enoch's time and Noah's time and being like, so the flood.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
So really seeing that flood, and it was a judgment from God, right? So it does give you that placement of, oh no, Enoch was way back in Genesis. And some of the stuff that he's talking about through this is kind of pertinent to then.
Yeah, I've been listening to the Bible Project guys as they kind of go through Deuteronomy, and they're talking about like the 3 speeches. But they talk about how like the way Moses addresses it to the new generation of Israelites, he makes it seem like they were the generation that messed up and why they wandered the wilderness, but they weren't. And it's the way they summarized it was that it's a way to do it so that every generation can see themselves as the wandering Israelites. And almost in a sense that you kind of have the same thing that's happening with Enoch. And for me, what I like about Enoch is it does touch a theme that is written throughout the Bible. There's 2 ways. There's righteous and there's wickedness. And a life of righteousness leads to this, and a life of wickedness leads to this. So it's almost like putting ourselves in the spot of like, okay, are you the flood people?
Right.
Were you part of the wicked or were you part of the righteous, and how you live your life today? And it does tie that in as we even go through these parables of like, there's 2 ways, righteous and wicked. And it's like a theme throughout the Bible that every generation has to answer, and every generation has to make a decision. What part am I in this whole thing? So I really like that it does do that. It kind of gives us a back and forth into it's talking to them. It actually made me think of wrestling because I just came back from WrestleMania. Their big intro to their thing is then, now, and forever. And then it ends with like together, but that's like they're basically saying like wrestling then, now, and then it's going to be forever. Kind of like it's the same thing in that situation, that what we see is like for then, but it also could apply to now, and it's going to apply to the next generation after us. Sorry, that was a weird tangent.
It was a little bit, but before, I think that we've talked about it, and we're just kind of think of who it applies to. I think that we've talked about Revelation having some of that, George. Just when you look at Revelation, are you seeing where you're currently at in there? But then there is the thing of there is that day of the Lord to come in. So it's a weird thing in the Bible that you have that cyclical type, but then it also is representative of a real thing.
Yeah, it's like it's representative of a real time of people that things happen to. It's representative of a time of whoever's reading it. And then it's representative of a time and a date that later will happen. And it's really fascinating. It's almost like people always say it, like, this is our generation for this, especially when they're doing like end times prophecy stuff. Like, this is all happening in our time. And there are some things that are like, yeah, that's actually happening in our time. That's kind of crazy. But throughout generations, people have always thought the day of Noah was their time. Because you could always find it, that the pattern of human rebellion that leads to corruption, that leads to Babylonian-like empires, is always a cycle that we will run to until the final judgment comes and wipes it away.
Let's get into these chapters.
Yeah, I could go on a weird tangent with all that. Hey everybody out there in the world. The latest update of the Christian Translator app has tons of new features. but one of them would definitely help with those hidden phrases or terms that you may not be familiar with. This specific new feature is understanding the Apocrypha option. To activate this feature, you go into your settings, you click on languages, and then select Apocrypha to unleash all the hidden terms and phrases. Now, when you hear your friend say something like, the Lord of Spirits, the Christian Translator app will simply say, that's God. Or if they use the term Watchers, the Christian Translator app will translate that for you to angels. With just one easy switch to the New Testament Apocrypha, you'll know that the term Didache means teaching, and the shepherd of Hermas wasn't one of the names of the shepherds who saw Jesus when he was born. It's also a fantastic tool when discussing the animal apocalypse. Yes, that's a real thing. You won't have to worry about sounding foolish anymore around your extra scholarly friends with the Understanding the Apocrypha feature. So update the Christian Translator app today and never be confused by what your Christian friends are saying again. The Christian Translator app helps you understand the language of the saints. I got some stuff for chapter 37.
All right.
Just that the vision of wisdom. Wisdom refers to the obedience of the Torah or to God. The vision of wisdom is an instruction because it details the fate of the disobedient and the righteous. And then there's that thing, to those who dwell on the earth. It's written to humans are the recipients of Enoch's divine revelation. And then the Lord of Spirits. This title isn't used in the other sections of Enoch, of First Enoch. That's the stuff outside of the parables. The general idea is that God is surrounded by and sovereign over spiritual beings in the spiritual world. And the title occurs 102 times in the parables. Which,
yeah, he uses a lot.
Yeah, I knew I read it a lot, but when I actually did the study and I was like 102, I was like, that's a lot for that many chapters to just kind of repetitively use it.
Well, it's like 30, I think we're covering 34 chapters just about. So that's like 3 times a chapter.
Yeah. And the only times it's not mentioned is 42, 44, 56, and 64. So there are a few chapters where it's not. And I really think 42 and 44 are those like one-line chapters.
Yeah.
But it also refers to God's statue as being Lord over the human spirit, so human beings. Let me read this. Hebrews 12:9 says, moreover, we have all had human fathers who disciplined us, and we respected them for it. How much more should we submit to the Father of the spirits and live? So Hebrews is using the same thing. Numbers does the same thing, and they fell on their faces and said, O God, the God of spirits, of the spirits of all flesh, shall one man sin, and you be angry with the congregation? So God of spirits. It's referenced in Psalms and Kings, but instead it's the Lord of hosts. And then Second Maccabees says, now when he was already there in the treasury with the bodyguards, the Lord of spirits and of all power made an amazing appearance with the results that all those who had dared to go in with him were astounded, and the power of God changed their boldness into feebleness and cowardice. So just lots of Lords of Spirit references throughout New Testament and Maccabees, which is Second Temple.
Girl, that was good. So that was kind of the intro, right? You're just like, I'm going to have this. And then he moves in 38 and onward as you're having it. So 38 says, the first parable, when the congregation of the righteous shall appear, and the sinners shall be judged for their sins and shall be driven from the face of the earth. So kind of telling you, here's what this parable is going to be about, right? Looking at that. But then it's interesting there in verse 2, it says, and when the righteous one shall appear before the eyes of the righteous, whose elect works hang upon the Lord of Spirits. There's that Lord of Spirits again, right?
Yeah.
But what you have here as compared to in the Book of the Watchers, in the Book of Watchers, you have God is the one that's showing up. And then here in these parables, you have it being the righteous one or the Son of Man. They're being talked about in very similar ways if you go back to that earlier books. And here you see, again, it's almost like that Trinity stuff that happens to where you're talking about God, but then you're talking about the Son, and you're saying the same things about both, or who is it that's sitting on the throne and who's taking action here. So where you have earlier God being representative and spoken about in this way, here you have the righteous one being spoken about in the same way and introduced in the same way and performing some of the same things. So just to draw out there that even as we talked about the Son of Man, the way that he's even being introduced is reminiscent of how we've already talked about God just a few chapters previous.
Yeah. The rest of, like you're saying, of chapter 38, there's judgment of the kings and the mighty who are on earth and those who rejected the Lord of Spirit. And one thing I just want to pull out from that is that it's important part is to know that they were now unable to repent.
Mm-hmm.
That part in there, it's rather that none of them will. And to me, this was kind of a little bit eye opening when it came to like the righteous and the unrighteous. And it's like, man, if someone went to like hell or Hades, Sheol, whatever we want to call that, that why couldn't they have a chance to repent in there? And I think this is a question that people ask all the time, like the damnation, is it forever? And what really helped with me reading this in First Enoch was the idea that like the way he kind of phrases it, it was that they didn't want to, even though they were being punished for what they had done. They had lived a life that was so separated, the wicked, that they were at just a point that like, no, we're still in our arrogance, not going to repent.
I've heard it said by pastors in years gone by, that the doors of hell are locked from the inside.
Mm.
It's not God locking it from the
Mhm.
outside. It's the other way around, which as I've thought about those, I'm just like, how much do I agree with that? But you can see it going back to Revelation, right? When you're looking at all of those things happening in Revelation in those end times, and it's saying that even then the people didn't repent,
Yeah.
right? Even in all those crazy times, people still not turning to God. So yeah, you can see something about just the rebellion that's there. But when you're looking about the rebellion as well, I wanted to highlight, you talked about the kings and the mighty shall perish.
Mhm.
There's a lot of language that happens throughout these parables that are kind of really specific rather than broad to like all humanity. You do get the specific thing about like, oh, the kings and the mighty being judged, or those later on that are using the metals for different things, right? Like they're being judged.
Mhm.
There's I think one or two spots where it does broaden it out. But when you're looking at the specificity of like, oh, the righteous ones, and then kind of who's being highlighted as those that oppose, it's like the oppressors and the wicked in those ways, which is interesting for me when I read through that kind of thing. Is that okay? But where's like your average person?
Yeah.
I'm just like, yeah, I totally get it. The kings and the rich that have just been like screwing up everybody's life and waging war and all this stuff. Yeah, they should be judged for all of that.
Mhm.
But then it's also like, should I read into these sections other people who are sinners? Do you get what I mean?
Yeah, I think what's the interesting part that I've always found is that when you do look at kings and rulers and mighty, it's usually boiled down to like oppression,
Mm-hmm.
like just the way they treated people below them.
Yeah, it's oppression, war,
Mhm.
and basically the greed.
Yeah, which is really just to me, it's like you would think, oh, there'd have to be worse things, but it's like no, they just treated people horribly, and it just reminds me of what Jesus was saying, like, if you want the spot at the table, the head of the seat at the table, then take the low seat. Like whoever follows me will be a servant,
Right.
type idea that the lowliness in Christian authority is the lowly figure, not the
You're not going to
oppressive.
be like the rulers of the world who lord it over people, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
that's what
You're
I was
gonna
trying to
become
think of.
servants.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. So 39, we got a whirlwind carries him off of the earth. And this whirlwind, again, reminding us of Elijah, who was carried off in the whirlwind. And then there's also some little imagery of in Job, where it said the Lord spoke to Job out of a storm.
Mm-hmm.
And then the Lord spoke, again, it says it in chapter 40, the Lord God spoke to Job out of a storm. Under the wings of the Lord of Spirit, that portion in chapter 39, wings is drawn from the Old Testament Psalms, and they're a protective theme. But it is odd since usually the chosen one or Jesus wouldn't need protection. So I think it does in that section. It's like the chosen one is under the wings of the Lord of Spirit.
Mm-hmm.
So it is a little odd. Scholars have wondered if the imagery has more to do with the idea of God's presence. So in here, that under the wings is more of God's presence than kind of the protection idea that we would see in the Psalms.
Yeah, I can see that. Kind of the thing that I think of beyond the Psalms too is when it talks about, way back in Genesis, right? Of the Spirit brooding over, and that image there is like I think it's like a hen with their wings out,
Yeah.
kind of covering, but just that covering aspect that, all the things are covered by. And yeah, you're saying the protection, but even the presence of just like, no, all of this is under my.
Yeah, I see it too. I mean, I'm glad you brought up chickens because since I have them, that when we have a hawk in the backyard,
You bust out your wings and get the
I
chickens
bust
under.
out my wings and they all come fluttering. But when they see my presence or even now that we have bear, when they see bear's presence, there's almost a sense of security for them. That like they could be afraid of something, or even if a cat's roaming, they could be nervous about it. But once I step out, there's like, oh, I feel better about it. So I could see that maybe it's a drawing of both the
Mhm.
protection and presence. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that in this and other chapters, I just like reading it for the thing of I really like heavenly imagery.
Mm-hmm.
And that where you just get like, okay, let's get off of this earth, off of this plane, off of this where everything's screwed up by sin and everything, right? And get into like God's presence the way that things are so clear cut
Mm-hmm.
to where like, yeah, he's the righteous one, he's the Lord of spirits. Here's all these angels who are um interceding, right? Who are praying, who are resting there, and just it's like, oh man, there's a reason why it's called heaven, right? And why
Mm-hmm.
people want to be in heaven. So I just highly recommend reading that. That's not
Yeah,
anything that
it's
I want to
so
read through,
much
but I just
imagery.
really like heavenly imagery when you
Mm-hmm.
get around God's throne because it really just puts you in a different place.
Yeah.
That's kind of all that I have on that.
Yeah, there's a lot of it too. Chapter 40, I think it has on the four sides of the throne, Enoch sees the archangels performing their task. So Michael's name means who is like God, your baby name, I think again.
Yeah.
Uh,
I wish we had a little jingle.
yeah, right. Unceasingly blesses the Lord of spirits. He is merciful and long suffering, kind of tying it into Exodus 34:6. Raphael, the healer of God. This is what his name means, God's healer, or God heals. He blesses the chosen one and the chosen ones. And he is set over all diseases and the wounds of the children of men. Gabriel, whose name is God is my warrior, intercedes for those on earth and makes supplication for them. He is over all the powers, and then he's also the destroyer of giants. And again, seeing even where Gabriel pops in the New Testament, and even in the Old, um, you could see this, like he's interceding, he's going back and forth and communicating with them the message from God. And then Faniel, hopefully I'm saying that one right. He fights back the devil who's trying to come and accuse those who dwell on the earth. And I thought this was interesting because his name is a play on Peniel, and this is from Genesis 32:30, where Jacob wrestled with the man who's actually an angel. The biblical place for the name means the face of God, and then where Phinniel means to turn. So it's literally or metaphorically in repentance or turn to God.
Yeah, so that goes with the name of what you were looking at there.
Mhm.
But it's interesting because you read off like, well, here's the names and what they were doing. But just before that, he's hearing the voices of them.
Mm-hmm.
And when you just look at what they're saying versus who they are, so the first voice, which would have been Michael, blesses the Lord of spirits forever and ever. The second voice, I heard blessing the elect one and the elect ones who hang upon the Lord of spirits. So that would have been Raphael. The third voice, I heard pray and intercede for those who dwell on the earth and supplicate in the name of the Lord of spirits. That's Gabriel. And then the fourth voice, fending off the Satans and forbidding them to come before the Lord of spirits to accuse them who dwell on earth, which would have been Phanuel. So it's
Mm-hmm.
interesting that on those, Phanuel is the one that's over repentance and hope for those inherit, but he's also fighting off the Satans, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's just cool when you link up the two and you're like, who's talking? Who's saying that? And you're like, well, this is this guy and this is what he does. It's kind of like, oh, cool. You got the Ninja Turtles of heaven.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry, you got Raphael
yeah,
in there.
yeah. And the devil's in there, it simply means adversary, but it shouldn't be confused with the figure in Job. But yeah, this is kind of what their role is. This is what their task is. One commentator adds, in this passage, the Satans are a special class of angels, no doubt
Accusers.
subject to Satan. So, again, just a lot of this kind of what we're picking up about angels and demons and the roles and what they're doing, and what the angels are doing, and what the demons are trying to do, and kind of come in there and shake the righteous ones. And you have one who's like fighting them all back and saying, nope, these are the chosen ones.
I know we keep touching on it, but especially since we're in these sections and it's a heavenly thing, we're talking about Lord of Spirits, right? And we're talking about these angels and then Satans. The spiritual world, even reading through this, is
Mm-hmm.
just becoming more and more expanse to me,
Mm-hmm.
right? So there's these Satans that are trying to come into the presence, and then you have Phanuel that's like fending them off. But that's different than even, because this is the parable looking at judgment, and later on we're going to be looking at Azazel and all of them and the judgment that's coming upon them. I was like, that's different. Right.
Mhm.
So when we're talking about Satan, how you said like that's not being highlighted as like Satan, big S Satan, right? So just like there is such a variety going on within the spiritual creatures, which even later on too, it talks about cherubim, seraphim, and did you catch the other one? It's like the ophonim,
Mhm.
the Ophonim.
Mhm.
It's like the roster is expanding.
Yeah.
As you read, it's almost like you're playing a video game. It's like, oh man, I just unlocked a new
Yeah.
character. Like, what is this?
It almost makes me think, and then we'll wrap up this episode. It almost makes me think of like anyone who comes under like who's accusatory
Mm-hmm.
is a Satan,
Yes.
and so it's like when you're accusing something or you're an adversary, you become a Satan in a sense. So like these demonic beings, although maybe their name is not Satan, they take on that characteristics. And then I thought about when Jesus told
Yeah.
Peter, "Get behind me, Satan." And a lot of people are like, "Whoa, what's this?" It's because of the accusatory, the accusation of, "No, no, you're not supposed to do that." And he's like, "No, this is the mission. You're trying to divert me from the task." So you've almost become a Satan in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
Which without this Enoch, I probably wouldn't have even made that connection in my head. It would just kind of stuck to the term of like, oh, he called him Big Satan, but it was more of like your actions are very Satanist,
Yeah.
I
Which
guess.
there's some of that because you brought up Job first, which you got in Job. It's Hasatan, the
Mhm.
Satan, like the accuser.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I don't know why Revelation is coming up so much, but like the accuser of the brethren that pops
Mhm.
up there and different things. So yeah, that accuser definitely big.
There's a idea and a notion, and and I think I heard this from Father Stephen DeYoung, that there's the dragon or the serpent that's in the garden is a Satan, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then there's the Job, the Hassan, like you said, the accuser was another one, but actually that was in God's rankings and did what he wanted.
Right.
And then there's the dragon at the end, and I think it was Father Stephen DeYoung puts it that when Jesus said I saw Satan fall in the New Testament Gospels, that it could have been the Hassan. So that the idea that there might be multiple versions or multiple Satans in a sense, it's a whole crazy theory and notion. And honestly, I think you'd have to go listen to the episode where he explained it because he'll do a better job.
So this is one of those things. Again, we're talking about First Enoch.
Yeah.
So if you made it this far and you're listening to First Enoch, like we're exploring concepts that are
Yeah.
outside of direct biblical.
Mm-hmm.
But going back to things that are within the Bible, because even some of the things that you just brought up, like, no, those are in Scripture. That's not an Enoch thing. Michael Heiser also had a really good episode on his podcast about kind of that development of who Satan is and how to
Mhm.
understand these different characters. So I don't know what episode it is, but go through his
There's 400.
Go through his
Have
library
fun.
podcast. There's one literally just it's titled something about Satan. And he's doing, I think it's an interview that he has with someone, and they're talking about that development as Satan as like that character, which I like that kind of thing because when you do have language that's being used and characters and how, again, the roster is bigger than, I initially thought. I want to understand it. Not that I'm like, oh yeah, definitely. Like they're all different. It's not just one Satan, but I'm seeking to understand.
Yeah.
I guess is where I'm coming out with it. Not to say that what we're presenting or saying, oh yeah, go listen to them, that it's trying to be like, turn away from your long held belief. But it's like, it's okay. You can ask questions. You can look at things, and if you walk away with, no, I really think that it still is just like, at least you're holding that belief in the face of evidence that people are looking at.
Yeah.
That's my things. Like, I'm not trying to bring up, and we're not trying to bring up getting into First Enoch to like make anybody confused or anything. But even as we talked about last time, that this book was read by the first century authors of the New Testament. They were familiar with the stuff. There's allusions and references and everything else. So to get in here and understand it a bit, it's like, it's okay.
Yeah, we're not trying to challenge anything that's being taught. It's more of these are other concepts and ideas that are out there. They're good to listen to, but with everything and anyone, take it with a grain of salt, bounce it off the Bible, and see where God leads you to it. But yeah, we'll journey more into the parables for the next couple of episodes, and then we'll get into some more fun with Enoch and all that other stuff. So
I think it was worthwhile taking that time to really look at the Son of Man, and
Yeah.
I like that part of the conversation because it was good.
yeah, we need to do it, and then it's done. So I'm Chris.
I'm Yurda.
We are your church friends. Thanks for listening.